Now, for the past few years, I have been exploring, and I'm saying the past few years because it is a euphemism, of course. I've become very British. I have been exploring two key areas with my research. On the one hand, the connection between translation and migration, or more generally, mobility, and I'll be talking about mobility in this context for a while. And on the other, the question of translation as method, as well as, but not only as, the object of research. So what I want to do today is talk about these themes and about what I call the new translation continuum, trying to connect them to contemporary notions of memory as well. And I'll do this via a small number of examples, 4 in total, if I can manage all 4, which are linked to the history of Italian mobility in particular. And that history, of course, includes both emigration and immigration, as well as internal migration for that matter. And it also includes complex itineraries which complicate and combine all of those trajectories. I'll be covering literature, the visual arts, and performance, and these two are undertaken by the people I'll be talking about as mixed medium and translational as well as transnational practices. Now, let me start with the context in which I have been carrying out this research. And as you kindly mentioned, one of the things I've been working on for the past few years is a large research project which is called Transnationalizing Modern Languages, which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, which, by the way, and this relates back to the end of the discussion, has now just launched its first ever joint funding initiative with the Medical Research Council. So there are signs of, rays of hope in the bleakness of our scenarios. But TML, as we call it for short, is a project that I've been describing from the start as the double helix of the DNA. On the one hand, what we're doing is rethinking, in ways that are similar to what Sandy was tracing now, rethinking the discipline of modern languages in that case, and trying to rethink it translationally and transnationally. I'll come to transnational again later on. And at the same time, we're looking at Italian mobilities. So within TML, we're asking what happens if we see multiple forms of mobility, including migration, translation, and other multilingual or polylingual. I do prefer polylingual. It's also backed in, as well as all the things that Sandra said, it's also backed in. So polylingual practices as deeply connected phenomena, involving multiple agencies and engaging both individuals and communities in the creation of complex knowledge, affect, and memory networks. And this means foregrounding the connectedness of different kinds of mobility as well as of translation. Now, let me start with mobility. And in a sense, this is where I start where Sandra stopped. Traditionally, forms of human mobility have been understood as separate entities and have been studied under different disciplines. But boundaries are shifting in disciplines as well as in human mobility itself. So much so that a few years ago, it was 2006, Hanan, Scherer, and Uri identified what they called a mobility turn, spreading into and transforming the social sciences, but I would say the humanities as well. As they noted, and I'm quoting them, the concept of mobilities encompasses both the large-scale movements of people, objects, capital, and information across the world, and the more local processes of daily transportation, movement through public spaces, and the travel of material things within everyday life. All of these mobilities are also entangled with linguistic phenomena and form multinodal webs which are relational and are performative, and which make little sense, I would say, if we try to interpret them in terms of traditional, atomized, discipline-bound models and methods. Instead, Tim Cresswell, for instance, in mobility studies, has suggested that we should adopt what Walter Benjamin, he will return again a couple of times, what Walter Benjamin, his concept of constellation, and think of how mobility manifests itself in different forms, coalescing into different constellations in different places and at different times. Now, let me move briefly to talk about translation and mobility. It has become almost commonplace in recent years to draw parallels between notions and practices of travel and of translation. And here, the pioneering work of scholars such as Susan Basnett and Michael Cronin in the area of translation studies, or Charles Forsick and Tim Youngs in the area of travel writing, has established a transdisciplinary dialogue centering on the question of how narratives represent interconnection between linguistic and geographic movement or transfer. In my own work, I have also repeatedly drawn that link and attempted to analyze how these two sets of practices are related, figuratively, historically, and also socially. More specifically, and also symptomatically, given the images and tropes that dominate public discourse and media today, and again we were starting to talk about earlier, the specific form of travel which goes under the label of migration has been repeatedly linked to translation. And one of the most iconic formulations, of course, of that connection is the one penned by Salman Rushdie, who described it as the word translation comes etymologically from the Latin for bearing a cross. Having been born across the world, we are translated men, or women, or children, indeed. Now, Susan Basnett's collection of essays, Translation, opens with another strong statement. The 21st century, she says, is the great age of translation. Millions more people are moving around the planet than at any time in history. And as those millions move around, taking their own languages with them, they encounter other languages, other cultural frameworks, and other belief systems. Hence are compelled, whether consciously or not, to engage in some form of translation. Now, what interests me here, more than the rhetorical gestures implicit in such broad statements, true as they are, is an increasing awareness of the pervasiveness of translation, which is beginning to call into question assumptions about the homogeneity as the norm for cultural and linguistic identity. In a nutshell, the old one nation, one language, one culture ideological norm. As well as the narrowly linguistic and strictly binary nature of translation. So, the source text, target text, source culture, target culture, source language, target language. What happens then, when we focus on migration and translation, is that instead of the homogeneity of cultures and linguistic, as well as more broadly cultural practices, what comes into focus is the complexity of the cultural processes and practices which permeate contexts of social, geographic, and linguistic mobility, as well as their ubiquity. And this means exposing, recognizing, if you prefer, either of those words, they have different connotations, of course, processes of linguistic and cultural translation and self-translation as the norm, not the exception. What the nexus between mobility and translation points toward is that what I call the translational fabric of texts and experiences. How many of the texts we read, but also the conversations we have, not least in this room, would simply not exist if it weren't for processes of translation, whether implicit or explicit. That is to say, processes built into communication from the start or inserted sequentially in individual or multiple shifts between and among languages and language variants. Now, two more methodological points before I move on to some practical examples, and I will get to memory now. So a further connection to be drawn here is the one between geographic and social mobility, and between these and translation. Migration history tells us that there is a strong connection, indeed, between migration and social positioning, though the correlation, of course, may turn out to be positive or negative. The migrant may climb the social ladder, but may also, and often, fall to the bottom of it. More recently, work by Naoki Sakai, Brett Nielsen, Sandro Mezzadera has pointed out the way in which a politics of translation and mobility in the geographical sense is linked to the functioning of capital and the management of labor, both manual and intellectual. And in this room we are first in intellectual labor, maybe also manual. This is another important area of exploration since, as Mezzadera and Sakai have recently noted, and I'm quoting them again, translation can be productive or destructive by inscribing, erasing, or redrawing borders. It is a process political par excellence, which creates social relations and establishes new modes of discrimination. Far from being conceived of as the other of violence, translation has emerged as deeply ambivalent as a concept and practice. Put simply, translation always cuts both ways, at once a mechanism of domination and liberation, clarification and obfuscation, commerce and exploitation, opening up to the other and appropriation. Translation, to further explicate its constitutive relation with the concept and institute of the border, produces both bridges and walls. So, translation can become, paradoxically, both an instrument of mobility and immobility. It can create borders as well as make them porous or accentuate their porosity. Now, if we think about time as well as space, another area in which boundaries and porosity, as well as the central role of mobility, have emerged as key concepts and methodological tools is that of memory studies. Here, studies of national memory have been increasingly integrated and to an extent superseded by research focusing on the multidirectional and multidimensional nature of memory work, its intergenerational dynamics, or the intricate networkings created by processes of transnational memory, which is the title of a recent volume, or traveling memory, to use Astrid Earle's terminology. Translation can be seen as a form of memory. Here's where Benjamin comes in again. In his famous essay, which was mentioned before, The Task of the Translator, with its notion of translation as the afterlife of the text, Benjamin somehow speaks about translation as a form of memory, if you want. But also, that image of translation as the painstaking recomposition of a broken vessel, which offers not only a powerful set of metaphorical representations of translation, but also of memory, I would say. It foregrounds the work of translation, its reconstructive power, as well as its inevitable transmutations. But it also prefigures the way in which memory, textual memory, historical memory, works with fragmentation, trauma, the remembering of dismembered experience of the past, and its remediation into individual and collective presence, as they push us towards the future. For memory, translation, and the angel of history also share that mixed blessing of this complex temporality. And memory, like translation, exceeds the boundaries of the nation and of the national, or for that matter of any other form of community I think that we might care to focus on. The construction of memory happens as a negotiation between the inside and the outside, across geographic and temporal fracture lines. Memory travels, to cite Earle again, across space and across time. There is no memory in a vacuum, no memory without a dialogue or a polylogue, as I learned yesterday, between experiences of the past and dreams, however bleak or blessed, of the future. Memory is transnational as well as translational, and I should add a quick note here on my use of transnational, because terminology matters. So, again, with yesterday's discussion in mind, the transnational is not, for me, in antithesis with, nor a substitute for, the nation or the national. They exist in tension as a reciprocal construction, or, if you prefer, as two modes of reading of the world around us. And they share their territory with other terms and other perspectives, international, supranational, multinational, each historically and politically connotated and located, each carrying the weight of its connotations. I have no illusion that transnational will be the last of our coinages, and I do not see it as a solution to our problems. Only as part of this constellation, a historical point of emergence, what Walter Benjamin described as the fleeting appearance of dialectical ideas, wherein what has been comes together in a flash with the now to form a constellation, dialectics as a standstill, yet always overflowing with tensions. Now, if I bring all of these perspectives together, what they point towards is the permeability of cultures, the intensely translational fabric of our lives, which is accentuated every time forms of mobility emerge and intersect. They also inevitably call into question some acquired notions and models of research. And again, this is a connection, I think, between our papers. For instance, they call for much more flexible notions of identity or identification even, than those linked to national or hyphenated labels even, Italian, Italian-American, but also to labels such as migrant, I would say. The foreground, the inevitable inadequacy of criteria which only allow work produced in a national language or within a national vernacular in other arts, again, I would add, to be seen as part of what are and what always have been transnational processes of cultural production, circulation, and reception. And they also point to the need to amplify our research beyond individual genres and media, embracing the complex, multimodal nature of creative processes as well as communication strategies. Now, this complicates our work, of course, as researchers, and also calls us to account in ways which are often personal and which require forms of affective as well as intellectual investment. And I want to end up there with the examples that I'm now going to give you. So let me give you my 4 examples of this translational fabric, all connected to migration and all connecting translation with the memory of migration. These will take us through a complex translational texture, a fabric made at various points of migration, colonial memory, orality, writing, scientific discourse, autoethnography, photography, visual arts, performance, and notions of mediation and remediation, as well as transnational and intergenerational memory. And let me note here that I could have equally spoken about cinema and class belonging, or about the transnational history of tango, or about Raffaella Carrà, as I did in a previous visit to the Cattolica a couple of years ago, as a national popolare and transnational product at the same time, or indeed of the work that within TML we have been doing with writers and with communities, with creative writing and in multilingual settings. We've been working very closely for the past 3 years with a translingual writer whose name is Shireen Ramzali Fazel, and with communities around the area of Birmingham in particular. Now, let me move to the famous example. So, and of course, yes, it worked. Okay, just me, not the system. So, first of the examples, Gabriella Germandi, and a movement from orality to performativity. So, her background. This is Gabriella performing at Warwick, actually, a couple of years ago. That's her there, and that's her sort of 5 minutes later, and I'll talk about that transformation, okay? Now, her background, she is a writer and performer of mixed Italian and Ethiopian descent, and her positioning of herself is as a storyteller and a bearer of memory. Her first book, Regina di Fiori e di Perle, was one of the most innovative novels to appear in the Italian panorama literary sort of landscape over the last, about 10 years ago now. And that book itself is the product of a mixture of orality and storytelling. She actually collected a series of interviews in her sort of life as a social worker, and then reworked those into a polyphonic narrative, which works as a form of individual but also crucially collective memory, translating the East African tradition of oral storytelling into this kind of entwinement of voices into the written form in Italian, but it's an Italian inhabited by other languages as well. So she's also at the same time translating the Ethiopian memory of colonialism, or rather of invasion, because Ethiopia rightly points out that it was invaded, it was not colonized, and of war. And once again, this is a form of writing back, but from the inside as much as the outside of the Italian community. So much so that what she's addressing in that book is also directly the Italian literary canon. Her work is also a rewriting of the most famous colonial novel in the Italian literary history, which is Ennio Flaiano's Tempo di Uccidere. There are further translations at play here. She is both resisting and embracing autobiography and family history. And in particular, through her use of music and her theatre, her performances, she puts these things into tension and into dialogue. She goes on stage talking about how, for a long time, she didn't want to talk about and to narrativize and perform and dramatize her family history. But that weight somehow eventually brought her to doing this. And her performance is also a performance of her two selves. But is it a binary translation, or is it translation as hybridization, as polyphonic form? It's interesting because her use of voice and her use of costume and her use of food is very fluid in what she does. So she goes on stage dressed in, what can I call that? Everyday clothes. Sort of, they're not exactly Western clothes. They're everyday clothes in the sense in which you could find them almost everywhere now. And she goes on stage looking again, for want of better words, looking like, one of us, anybody. And then she takes out these garments, which are her family heirloom, and she puts them on, and very dramatically puts them on, and transforms herself. And okay, this is a trick I played with you, because I put that picture smaller and this picture bigger, but I promise you, when you see her on stage, you see her amplified somehow. Mm-hmm. You see her bigger. It's of course, it's body, posture, and it's also the costumes. And she also uses food, so she goes around her audiences, which are not or usually small, distributing food, traditional food from the Ethiopian community. But again, food that's been translated, transported, which is in many senses not an attempt at authenticity in any sense. So her performance and her performativity and her self-translation, visual self-translation on stage, transformation, if you want, are a form of a recurring element of contemporary Italian migrant writing, by the way, especially by women. They're common to the work also of others, such as Ijaba Shego. And it's interesting because these works, and Gabriella certainly, occupy different space and perform different identities. But at the same time, the visualization of the translation is through this fabric, this interconnecting of the different positionings. And the dressing ceremony on stage is very much part of that ritual. Translating all of this into English, which she's recently been doing, and that's what she was doing in Warwick, performing this for the first time, I think, in English, multiplies her audiences and foregrounds accents. So her English, her Italian is not accented, but her English is very much an accented English, and that, again, layers her performances in this case. And what she's stressing is that this is not a process of splitting personalities, but rather of multiple storytelling, multiple levels, multiple audiences, but it's not a question of schizophrenia, to cite the word that Todorov famously used in his own assessment of his own multilingualism. Now, the link here is also to the work of a whole host of translingual writers and performers, but the one who sprang to mind also because the connection, of course, is with Lisbon. When I was last here, Yoko Tawada was here. And Yoko was talking about the way in which she sees her work not as, again, multiple personalities, but as a multilingual web, her words, where translation performs a transformative process for the author in the first instance, and words where it is a mirror in which you see yourself for the first time. Now, let me move to my next case now. Right one? Yes. I'm not going to open that link, but you can go to it. It's easy enough, and I'll show you something later. But what I would have liked to play is an audio file where you hear a babel of languages, indeed, with the Compagnia delle Poete. But the Compagnia, so that web and that texture that I was talking about for Gabriella and indeed Yoko Tawada and many other multilingual and migrant writers, well, migrant writers is a label I struggle with, by the way. That texture is even more evident in the work of the Compagnia delle Poete. For those who know Italian here, of course, Compagnia delle Poete is an agrammatical statement, but very much a statement that they want to make. And as I'll show, they play with languages in a number of other ways. Now, the genesis of the group is interesting in itself. They are an itinerant and sort of metamorphic group which has comprised up to 20 voices, though they're never on stage all at the same time. It was created in 2009 by Mia Leconte, who's a Franco-Italian poet and writer, together with a number of other women from a variety of backgrounds. Some, like Mia, sort of actually having moved from Italy elsewhere, but constantly moving between, others having moved to Italy with a series of also professional and personal backgrounds. They have so far produced 4 theatre compositions called Acromazie, Madrigne, Le Altre, and Novunque. All of these play with language and with Italian in very interesting ways. 2 volumes, Novunque, which was published in 2012, and Madrigne in un'unica partitura, which was published in 2015 and was edited by a friend, Gioia Panzarella. Now, it's interesting here that we have, again, collective and individual voices. And the metaphors that they use here are not so much the metaphors of weaving that I've been using, but those of the partitura, the musical script. So the other image that is often used, and they have it there, that's the opening page of their website, is the matryoshka. So the matryoshka is the sense not only of multiple women, but also of an inhabiting of multiple languages, or languages which are multiply inhabited. And Italian for them is indeed an inhabited host language. It's dynamic, so the group is dynamic, transformative in nature. It keeps changing, and some people leave, some people sort of join. They produce, in the first instance, written material, which then gets shaped into performances, which keep changing. So it's difficult to stabilize as a text or even as a video. The audio files, as I said, are interesting because in some of their audio files, they actually superimpose a variety of voices and languages, so that sense is very much physically audible. I'm thinking of Michael's work, of course, on the concept of audibility rather than visibility of voices and languages. And it's always, as I said, an inhabited, accented language. Now, the word madrigne, which is one of, possibly the most famous of their works, is worth also a note. It came out of a creative mistake, as so often translation does. It was created by another friend, unfortunately no longer with us, Julio Monteiro Martins, Portuguese writer who then moved to the States and moved to Italy, wrote in multiple languages, and was incredibly creative with language. And he called them, oh, you're my madrigna. Madrigna, of course, doesn't exist in Italian, but madrigna is a mixture of madre, madrina, the godmother, and matrigna, the stepmother. Okay, so all of them together. And they adopted that word. They picked it up and sort of and run with it. So there's a common trait here, the transcultural nature of all the work, as well as of the individual voices that form this group. They foreground Italian, as I said, as a host language, a language of choice for all of them, whether that choice was in the first instance of necessity or otherwise, but now a language of choice for their artistic production, and also, as I said, an accented language. Orality, performance, and a mixture of genres, from lyrical to narrative, form the basis of what they do, with wonderful ironic moments such as this. And I'm going to read you this in Italian. If you want me to translate it, I'll have a go, but see if you follow it. It's called Eva, and it's by Barbara Pomhosel, one of the members of the group. Sono stufa di vedere Eva che morde la mela sotto lo sguardo del serpente. Eva che quadro dopo quadro viene ricacciata dal paradiso. Vorrei vederla seduta sul ramo più alto del melo, con le gambe a penzoloni. Vorrei vederla sorridere mentre prepara una torta di mele, o ancora mentre, cantando, pianta i semi. Do you want me to translate it? Yes. Okay. I'm fed up of seeing Eve biting the apple under the gaze of the serpent. Eve who, painting after painting, is chased again from paradise. I'd like to see her sitting on the tallest branch of the apple tree, her legs dangling down. I'd like to see her smile while she prepares an apple pie. Or even while singing, she sows her seeds. So, the foregrounding of voices and the superimposition of them and the superimposition of genres and the playful use of an inhabited host chosen language is what this is particularly apt as an example of, I think, here. Now I want to move to my third example, which is to do with two visual artists. Visual artists who, by the way, well, in one case, use also intensively textual material in terms of written text, and the other one is a performer. One is Biamore, and the other one is Lucy Calipari Marcuzzo. Their names are also significant, by the way. So the two examples from visual artists, one from the USA, B, and the other one from Australia, Lucy. Biamore is a third-generation Italian-American. Her family originates from Naples. And she works with mixed media. A lot of her work is with collage. She has, if I can actually, let me open very quickly her website, which is fantastic. Yeah, I'll reopen the PowerPoint at some point when I've shown you the two things I want to show you. So, one of the fantastic things she did in 2006, she did this incredible exhibition at Ellis Island, which was 7 of the rooms that were used for the processing of migrants on Ellis Island, including her own grandparents as they came through, of course. And she filled these rooms with all kinds of material, personal family material, but also more collective materials taken from her interviews, her contacts with a number of migrant communities, not just the Italian-American one, by the way. And B sort of works with all of these materials. She also works, I want to show you one more thing, which is this, her memory boxes, which are fantastic. You know that the idea of the icons that you open up, you know, this sort of sacred images. So she works with families and she produces this with mementos from migration, and then the text, again, the calligraphy is integral to this. So there's this mixture, and there's this real dialogue, as you can see, with memory, with individual memory, with family memory, with collective memory that she's playing with. Now, I'll talk a little bit about her and about Lucy, and then show you the video of Lucy, because that will make sense after I explain a few more things. Now, both as I said, Biamore and Lucy Calipari Marcuzzo, who Lucy is a second generation in her case, Italian-Australian. Now, both of them follow personal itineraries and construct networks of knowledge, memory, and affect. It's personal as well as collective memory, as I said, as well as affections. Not often, what is interesting here is that also they're not talking about their own personal experience of migration. It's intergenerational memory, of course, because what they're talking about, they're talking as second generation, as third generation, about an experience of migration which is passed down, both as enriching and as traumatic, but through the generations, rather than something that is first-hand experience. And there's a process here which is also of rewriting and translation, starting from their names. B. Amore is Bernadette Amore, but she calls herself B. Amore. And Lucy, of course, you saw it before, it's not spelled Lucy with a Y, it's not spelled Lucia, which is Italian one, it's spelled Lucy with an I. So again, that sense of a name which already labels them as translated women in that sense. And the use of multiple media and multiple languages is also very striking. Both of them and all of their work is about making memory, is about the materiality of objects and how they reframe all of our memories. So they are themselves reframing objects and texts, and their mutual framings. By putting objects and texts in dialogue with each other, they reframe each other as well. They use places in significant ways. So Ellis Island, for instance, for B, but she's also done exhibitions in Naples and elsewhere. And in the case of Lucy, she does performances in specific places which have connections with migration. And there's a very strong question also of class and of labor, which is reinscribed in the memory of migration by both of these artists. One of the objects that are absolutely iconic of B's work are working gloves, which are objets trouvés. She goes around sort of collecting them, and she now has a number of us going around the world collecting bits and pieces. Now, I've sent her two gloves over the last couple of years. And she may use them or not use them, but it's that sense of, but it's laborers' gloves, it's objects that have a history of work. There's a fantastic piece that was at Ellis Island, and which was this transparent pane of glass on which lay a wonderful embroidered tablecloth, which was the work of our grandmother. And over that, she had laid pickaxes, not the wooden part, just the metal part, pickaxes, and the old ironing, the irons, you see what I'm saying, the ones made of iron. Yeah. And they looked like ships across the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. And on Ellis Island, you could not but read them as the symbols of the men and the women who were crossing the Atlantic as working class, as labor. And with Lucy, I will show you in a second what happens with her performances. Because she is, in her case, she's retracing and recreating, but also creating, that's one of the things that fascinated me in her work, creating things that didn't exist. I want you to listen to a very brief video of Lucy speaking about her work. And hopefully this now comes up, yes? Okay, so.
With every stitch, I'm retracing the threads of the past. I'm re-exploring, retracing the threads that my family created when they emigrated to Australia in the 1950s. I am an artist, and I'm here today doing a live art performance and installation called Tracing Threads of the Past, Facendo Fili del Passato, which is the Italian translation. Sewing is a tactile thing. You have to kind of feel your way, and in a way I've been having to work out what language my sewing machine is speaking to me. So I've translated, in a way, how it stitches, and those threads in a form of language as well. I've used a template from my grandmother's original apron, which was passed down to my mother when my grandmother passed away. The reason I'm making the apron and reimagining, I suppose, the tradition of the peasants, they really made do with what they had. And the apron wasn't only used in the kitchen, it was put on in the morning over their clothes. It was like an armour, I suppose. What I'm doing is retracing their journey, their experiences, creating things for themselves that they couldn't afford, to be able to retrace those threads, to be able to...
Okay. Let me stop there, try to reopen the PowerPoint and tell you a couple of things. But you will have caught some of these words. She's talking about her sewing machine as a translation machine. She's talking about languages. And she's also talking about something else. She's talking about translation and language and her own creative work as a memory of what was there, but also a memory of what wasn't there, a memory of what those women couldn't afford. It's a memory of desire. Her performance of migration also inhabits and somehow produces the desires that those women had, but which they couldn't materialize at that point. So it's the memory of that desire that moves the artistic production of a second, third generation artist. And I think it's very important that we think about memory both in terms of trauma and in terms of desire. And we think of migration both in terms of trauma and in terms of desire. So the other thing that interests me here, and of course, the work of both Lucy and Bea, it's glaringly connected, but they were working unbeknown to each other at two ends of the world, with no connection between them. One of them, her main exhibition is called Il filo della vita, the lifeline of life, and the other one is talking about tracing threads of the past. Even the metaphors they use are the same. But it was really interesting because the first time that they ever came together was through my work as a researcher. They're now in touch and they're aware of each other, and Lucy in particular, who's the younger artist, is very much looking at Bea's work and the history of her work in developing her own reflections on her own work. But it's really interesting that that was happening, and that research, again, what can we do? Researchers can also create these kinds of connectivity, which I think is one way in which we get involved in what we do. Now, the other interesting thing here is that Italy functions for both Bea and Lucy as both center and periphery of these works. Now, Bea and Lucy were working, one in the States, one in Australia, without substantially touching each other, but also without substantially touching Italy. And the connection between their works, as I said, was done mostly through the work of research. And then their work came together for the first time at the opening of an itinerant exhibition, which is part of that project I was talking about, TML, which opened in Rome, at the British School of Rome in October, and then has since traveled to London, to New York, and to Melbourne, mutating and changing in all of these places. But Bea's work was there. And then she came to the New York exhibition, which also included it. Lucy was present in Rome and did one of her performances in which she was sitting at an all-singer machine, which we've located for her in Rome, and she was wearing one of her grandmother's dresses. She had her hair up, as she does in these cases, so there. And she produced, from material which was in her family, she produced one of the aprons she does, which then traveled with the exhibition. And she then reappeared at the Melbourne event, where instead of this sewing performance, she did an embroidery performance, where she was sitting and inviting people, mostly women I have to say, but people to sit and embroider with her as well. So bringing these things into the space and into that community, as opposed to an exhibition that just travels in a kind of neutral way and into what's supposed to be neutral spaces. So in Rome, at that point, the center, Italy, the center of memory and of desire in both artists' work, also became a material place where an audience, national and international, could connect their work in the context of an exhibition which tried to materialize, perform, and translate into a set of embodied experiences, both the history of Italian mobility and the equally embodied practices of research. Now, I want 5 more minutes because I want to talk about the final example, because it's also about, again, personal involvement and research. So that was the exhibition, by the way, and if you go to the TML website, you can see a trailer of the exhibition in which Lucy appears also at her sewing machine. Now, the last example I want to talk about. This is now about reframing photographs, and it's about also the complexity of the itineraries of translation. It's something that we've been talking about quite a lot, but the fact that translation is not just a movement from A to B, but it's what I playfully called the ping-pong theory of translation. Translation moves in mysterious ways, never hits the same spot twice, but continues to move in different ways. Now, one last example then, which will further call into question also, or bring into play perhaps, my own position, the position of the researcher and of her own memories or memory practices. Now, this is a story about the migrant life of objects and of people, multiple migrations and multiple reframings of a set of photographs. The story is the story of photos and their uses, and it's the story of the Peruzzi family. The person there, you guess where that photograph was taken? Does it look like? And does anything strike you there? I mean, I could speak for an hour just on that photograph, but it's on a Vespa, of course. The guy's wearing jeans and a rolled-up T-shirt, looking very much like James Dean, and even a cap, etc. But the landscape is not American. You can see young cypressus trees. It's taken in Tuscany, of course. Where else? Now, the Peruzzi family were a family from Tuscany. Still are family from Tuscany. They're a family from Tuscany, and they were literally, their home base at the beginning of the 20th century was literally 200, maybe less, meters away from my grandparents' house. Mm-hmm. And in the early 20th century, they moved to the United States. They moved to the States where the two children, Duilio and Lina, the son and a daughter, were born. And then with the crisis, the crash, the early 1930s, they moved back to Tuscany. And they moved back to the same house. Duilio grew up as my father's best friend. They went to school together, they went through the war together, all of those things. They did things I probably better not know together, etc. Okay. And then at the end of the war, the Peruzzi family received a letter. Lina and Duilio were American citizens because they were born in the States. So they received a letter saying, you're welcome to come back. And on the strength of that, the family moved back. Duilio was a very clever boy and also a man, a male child. So he went through, he had gone through education, he'd just finished high school, the Magistrali in Italy, but he then went to night school in the States and got his high school diploma and then went to university and eventually started a PhD. Lina didn't, which is nothing, I think, to do with her intelligence, but more to do with gender, in all probability. And then in 1956, Duilio came back with a Vespa, a whole load of state-of-the-art photographic apparatus, and his look like James Dean. And he took about 700 photographs, which were part of the documentation. He was a geographer, a social geographer, and he was studying at the University of Michigan for a PhD, and he took 700 photos of sort of documenting a PhD which was called Cortona, that's my town, his town, in Italy, a valley hill mountain complex of modified Mediterranean agriculture in central Italy, completed and awarded in '63. Okay? Now, that is not a piece of art. This is a piece of scientific discourse, and those photographs are meant to document that scientific discourse. And that is the picture that allegedly my father took of Duilio on the Vespa, and it's one of the few that are not part of that series that is for the PhD. It was actually taken as a souvenir. Later on, Duilio started teaching at the University of California. And as part of that, he, at various points, became the director of the Italian program in Florence that University of California runs. And he maintained his contacts with his family in Italy, but also with my family as his best friend. So I knew Duilio ever since I was a child. Mm-hmm. And then at a certain, he kept coming and going, moving backwards and forwards, being Italian in America and American in Italy, of course, and both, in both places. And then in 2003, the photographs were... Some of his friends who had a photographic club in Cortona said, you got all this material, it's fantastic, let's use it. So they set up a photographic exhibition, about 300 of the photographs. And they set it up, let me see if I got that, in the castle from which this picture is taken. the fortress at the top. Cortona is a hill town. So when you walked in there, you had, amongst other things, this photograph framed next to the window from which it was taken, but 50 years before. So what did that now become? What this and the other photographs, this, Cortona, by the way, is the capital of the Chianina breed of cattle. If you've ever had a Florentine steak, that's what it should be made of, and those are the cattle. So, you know, it's a big thing, or it used to be a big thing, the cattle market. Killing of the pig, something that was a ritual at the time, so he documented that. And I'll leave that photograph there for a second. So what this became now, it was no longer a scientific apparatus for a piece of a scientific discourse, but rather something quite different. The landscape framed by the same window 50 years later. This image of sort of autoethnographic nostalgia, if you want, you know, that the CD that they produce with that, again, the pair of oxen pulling a cart, which no longer exists. I vaguely remember them. Between myself and my sister, at this 8.5 years of distance, she doesn't remember them, I remember them. So this was now reframed as a piece of autoethnographic nostalgia, and also sort of as a way of reproducing the memory of that period, not any longer for Americans who didn't know anything about that place, but for the people of that same place, but across the generations. And then, of course, to this, you have to add my own reframing of this material. So this material was then displayed, well, I'm lecturing on it, but it was also displayed in that exhibition in Rome, in Melbourne, elsewhere, as an example of Italian migration. How does that work? Well, migration works in multiple, complex itineraries. So did Duilio migrate to Italy? Did he migrate to the States? What are the movements? And what are the movements of these photographs? So my own reframing is also very important. And there's a final part of this that I want to talk about, because the interesting thing is that I'd spent 2 years researching all this area and researching it for that project and thinking of material for the exhibition and all of this. And it had never dawned upon me to think of this material. I have the CD, I'd had it all the time. But it was in my personal box. It was not in my academic box. And then I was at home, and it was my mother's birthday, and Duilio was there, very frail, my mother even more frail. And suddenly I thought, I have your material. Can I use it? Do you give me your permission to use it? And suddenly that crossing happened. And the sad part of this for me is that I then thought, okay, I'll interview Duilio, I will also try to do that. And I went all the way to San Francisco, but then he was very, very frail. And what he said to me is, I can't. And I can't, not because I don't remember, not because I wouldn't be able to, but if I see you, I see your father. And if I see your father, I see my youth, and I cannot do that. And I think as a researcher, you also have to respect that. You have to respect the fact that someone may say something like that to you. But that's also the price you pay when you enter that frame as a researcher. There is an extra coda to that, because, so I didn't manage the interview, but there is now a connection. There's a shared intergenerational memory between me as a daughter and as a researcher and his son, who is, by the way, also an academic, though not in the humanities, and who's trying to decipher now, to translate his father's writing, penned down over the years in a mixture of Italian and English. And so I'm now helping him to decipher that writing. And neither of these, of course, are full translation, but they are texts which, as I was saying earlier, would not exist without all of these translations. So let me finish. What I hope I have shown through my theoretical, methodological meanderings and through my examples of creative practice and personal involvement is how mobility and its memory are constituted as a complex network of translational acts. In studying new and old Italian migrations, or any other migration histories for that matter, those networks, their constellations, their serendipity and their tragic, traumatic moments need to be carefully followed and reconstructed in ways that underline and accentuate the permeability and inclusivity of cultural practices, even when they are exclusionary, paradoxically, because memory can and often does recuperate the exclusion as a way of overcoming prejudice, deprivation, and even violence. The construction of the memory of mobility is in itself a complex translation process, which involves local and global acts of creation, the making and remaking, framing and reframing of objects and narratives. Systematizing these processes is extremely difficult. And I'm struggling with that. How do I publish this kind of stuff? It's very complicated to think about how you, again, frame it into that academic container. Talk to you. Yes, I'll talk to you. Fine, I'll talk to you. But Benjaminian constellations, with their associations to notions of fragment, mosaic, collage, montage, and the warning against any temptation presented by linear, teleological visions of history and of progress and of translation, can indeed help us to catch important and only apparently serendipitous connections, such as those which link a third-generation Italian-American artist to a second-generation Italian-Australian, working independently on two opposite sides of the world, coming together for the first time in Rome last autumn, as I mentioned. Or like those which link me, my childhood memories, and my practices as a researcher to a history of multiple migrations, appropriations and reappropriations, which repeatedly took Tullio, his family, and his photographs across the Atlantic over almost a century, while my own family stood remarkably and pointedly still apart from me.